Hello.
Hello. Hi. Sorry I'm late.
Hello, could you hear me? Hi. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I was talking into the void again, but welcome.
Yep. See, so I'm late, but there aren't many people joined yet. But yeah, since it's 4 minutes past, I guess it makes sense to start anyway. So welcome everybody to the September 2nd SIG Multicluster call. I don't think there's anything specific to scrub this week. And Laura, you've got the only topic, placement decision API.
Yeah. Can I
I'll set things
some
up.
screen share? Thanks.
Yep, I will do
Yeah.
that. There you go.
Okay. This window. Okay. So I don't know if everybody who's been talking on this is here, but I wanted to bring it up just to keep it moving along. And first, I'm going to mention it more broadly in a way that is easier to see. Okay, so the placement decision API is a KEP proposed to represent how arbitrary schedulers or placement controllers, which are not defined necessarily in this KEP, can write a Kubernetes API kind called a placement decision that encodes in it information about where a workload should be placed in like a potentially multi-cluster situation. And this thing could be read by other stuff, also not necessarily defined, but here's some examples of things that occur in the world today, so that they actually manifest on the place that this thing yelled into the void to place it in. So that's the general idea. Also, if somebody who actually wrote this wants to interrupt me at any point, please do. But I just want to make sure we're all on the same page before I say anything. Okay, and then the API itself looks like this, but I think there's a more, there's an example here that is easier to read. So this would be the placement decision API, and then it would have some decisions about where this would go. This would interact with the cluster profile API from the perspective of SIG MC, so that the destinations could be like known as these first class objects that are aware that they are clusters of this type, and maybe that could like have the whole plumbing hook into like cluster profile credentials or something. But this section here is how the placement is being articulated in this placement decision. And this, I think, is the current like spot of discussion / contention on the PR from like recent comments. So that's what I wanted to lift about today and bring up to people who have been following or get some more thoughts or whatever. So notably, this KEP describes a placement decision, but does not describe a placement decision request, which is explicitly written as a non-goal here, describing how a scheduler made its choice, which is the placement part, but also this one is actually what I was just alluding to, standardizing the placement request format. So really, these non-goals cover two components of the life cycle of these that are not referenced in this KEP. And so part of the conversation is how much of those attendant things that are being alluded to or assumed in this KEP can we like really get away with not defining in this KEP or not. And for this case of the placement, there's some comments which I'll open the way that it looks. I didn't do that right, but that's okay. Here, I'm going to scroll down to this comment, which I think puts it in context of here about can we avoid relying on an object that hasn't been defined yet, like this placement type? How would a non-scheduler specific or aware consumer use this without knowledge of the placement object? So kind of trying to use this as an example to keep digging at the question of where does this KEP end and where does the obligation of the implementers of going up, the implementers of all of these things around this KEP have to pick up, again, writing like stuff that is anticipating a non-standard input or output. Okay, hopefully I didn't explain all of that too abstractly, but that is the kind of backstory of this KEP, and then the situation of the like current question kind of landing on this. So I'm going to take a pause for a second. Is there any questions on what I said or responses?
Well, maybe I'll
Yeah.
just expand on it a little
Yeah.
bit since I wrote those comments.
Sure.
So I'm aware that this is listed as a non-goal. Well, all of these questions about the scheduler or the consumer. Well, the scheduler obviously knows what the placement is, but the consumer having to know implementation details and so on. But I'm a bit wary of really the feedback from people working on Gateway API, where Gateway API has a wide open design that allows for a variety of backend references. And it turns out that the only ones that are really useful, or at least that consumers in general can use, are those that have a shared definition that exists within the sort of Gateway API group. And so having something where you don't have to care about the implementation detail is lofty goal that nobody ever really reaches, unless you really have concrete API to do something where you don't care about the implementation, but you can express what you actually want to do, and that isn't really the case here, I think. So maybe this is fine, but I would like to discuss it a bit more. So Mike,
Yeah, go
guess
ahead,
you've got
Mike.
lots to say.
No, so first of all, thank you, Laura, for that great summary, and thank you, Stephen, for the feedback, and Laura for the feedback as well. And I think both of you hit it exactly on the spot, right? Like when I put in that example, I definitely made a mistake because that's if you scroll down a little bit where I have the example of the kind of alluded to a common, especially under that, like that was definitely a mistake because the whole point of me and the rest of the folks that are involved in this that created this placement decision is because it'll take us we assume it will take us a long time to get to a consensus on a standardized placement because like it's we have a whole bunch of multi-cluster provider out there, CMIO, Kamada, etc. We all have our own independent schedulers, and ours, and I think I forgot it was an MCO on the GKE as well, and all our placement specs are quite different. And then the whole goal of this kit was mainly to standardize the output, like as what Laura said, right? We we're hoping that the consumer will only care about where they're gonna place their workload to by looking at the placement decision, and then they can, and regardless of which scheduler or multi-cluster provider they're using, they can still consume the same output, and that makes it easier for the consumer, right? Without having to import the other schedulers. I don't know if it's specs or common API, whatever. So the mistake I made here is the reference to have the common API, but maybe it should have been like a name or something. So a name of the placement request itself. So the consumers only needs to watch for they know the name of the scheduler or the placement, and then they can act on the output, which is in the decision itself. So that's what we were hoping to accomplish with this cap. And then we're not really looking to formalize the placement API or the scheduling spec at all. And the whole goal of the cap was again to intentionally not to do that because we think it's a hefty goal and it'll take forever to get there, and then having this placement decision will help consumer do some multi-cluster stuff like Cube, like Argo CD, etc. So that's what my 2 cents, and I wonder if anyone have anything to add or any questions.
I do, but also I'll wait for if anybody else wanted to hop in first. Going once. Going twice. Okay, I'm gonna keep talking. So yeah, totally get that. I think I understand. I feel good that I understand what the vision is for the team, and I think maybe it's a matter of like, can we get that sufficiently motivated in here and still feel confident that the thing that we're proposing is either like uh isolated and abstracted enough from like those other dependent things that like we feel confident, or at least we feel like articulate like where that gets handed over. And I think so first off, I hear you say that like this being like a in this group and of this type is like not necessarily like the vision. So I think that's one thing that we like should be rewritten in here, and then we can like relitigate this from wherever that stands. But even if it's some other type of thing that is referring to some other like proprietary thing or some like thing that just hopes there's another thing of that name somewhere. Like there's some sort of handoff in terms of like what the responsibility is of knowing what type of thing that thing is, that then makes the consumer have to like do whatever specific logic to like interpret whatever this thing is, right? So I think if this thing is something we define, then we can tell in the KEP how the placer, I guess, can interpret this thing. If we make this thing something really generic, then we have limits to how we can tell the placer how to interpret this thing. And we're either telling it nothing, which is, I think, what we would like to avoid, or we need to articulate what the obligations are of the placer of like how to translate from whatever super abstract thing this might be into whatever it can actually work on. And it might be like that this is some sort of name, and what we write here is like, you have to have a list of your own things that you think this name might refer to and go like list all of them and hope one of them matches. That could be like a way that we say it, and that's something we can litigate if that's like good enough to like be an answer in this KEP. But I think that's like an example, you know, of what that would be. And to tie it into one thing up here that I think also makes this really concrete is there is a definition of placement, like the word placement up here, and this really dense sentence here that I think is important, where it says consumers may still need scheduler specific knowledge to fully understand placement intent, which I think is kind of implied in this, like if this is not something we define specifically, then it needs to know more stuff. But also the basic workload distribution can be achieved by simply deploying to the cluster listed in decisions. I think this part here has to be possible for this KEP to like have provided some value, because the consumers have to be able to act on the placement decision, even in the most basic of case. And I don't think that it's necessarily clear right now that without those consumers knowing what this is, or knowing how much work they have to do to like transform this into something they could literally apply to their cluster, that we have achieved this second half. So I think that's like the most concrete way of saying, I think, what is missing. And yeah, so I would love to see some thoughts about that. Hi, Mike.
Well, before I go, does anyone
Yeah.
want to reply? I'm
Yeah.
gonna do the 3 seconds slower thing.
Yeah.
3, 2, 1. So I originally, if you go back to the example or the KEP description, I think originally I didn't even have this placement reference. So the whole goal of what I have was in the labels there. If you see under labels, there's the decision index 0, which is, in case there's a lot of decisions, so it make it, blah, 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 and not go over the ETCD limit. But the second one is actually the thing that the consumer is supposed to use to look up on for a particular placement request. So in this case, it will be an app placement, right? So where an Argo CD going to place the applications to. And then using these labels, they're supposed to do a lookup, and then which finds all the placement decision related to this particular app placement. And then that's how they pick up, oh, I need to go to cluster 1, I need to go to cluster 2. So I maybe to solve the basic use case right now, I'll just remove the placement reference, because that's causing all the confusion, and do a better explanation on the label, which is the actual use, how the consumer is going to use it to find all this. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think even if you get rid of this and make it more like this, which may have been the initial intention, the jump from this to the consumer knows how to deploy this work is still a huge chasm right now. I do think that there's some assumptions that the authors have of like, oh, this is how Argo CD would do it, or oh, this is this, which sounds like it might be based on the fact that there is like a hidden assumption that the tooling that uses this will have applied labels like this onto like proprietary objects of theirs that are of like workload deployable types, and that was encoded in the request in the first place. And I think that is fine, but I do think that's an assumption of the authors that's not clear in the CAP, and I think it needs to be clear in the CAP if that's true. And I think that's where we do end up getting back into the, like, defining what the placement is, but at least in terms of articulating the assumptions of like the types of yeah, placement like this, or whatever we want to call this thing. Placement requests and placement are also, you know, two different components where the placement could have been in the placement request, I guess. But yeah, I think whether it's like through some examples of what you have all already seen, why this like looks to you like it's something that like can expand to something that like a consumer can actually use. Because I think as written in the CAP by itself, without like knowing or knowing those like assumptions, it feels like it's not possible, or it's not like realistic to standardize on this without standardizing on that. And if you have an argument that that is still possible because there's some assumptions built into how this can work that's based on the reality of how things are now, then I think that should be like expounded on a lot in this CAP so that we can interpret that as part of it. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. And you absolutely hit it on the dot, right? Like this did come from the one of the Argo CD integration. So they do have something like this, and then it uses the similar method. So yes, you're absolutely
Yeah.
correct. We need to hammer out that point.
Yeah.
And then yeah.
Cool.
Yeah,
Yeah, because I
if I,
think. Oh no, go ahead.
yeah, sorry. Yeah, if I put it another way, I think the missing piece is, you know, you were saying, Mike, that the label is what the consumer is supposed to use to look up, but what does the consumer look up using that label? Is it supposed to go and look for, I don't know, something in the work API that matches, and then do that on the using the cluster profiles? Is it something else? That's the, at least to me, that's the missing piece.
Got it.
Yeah. And I recognize that you did put it as a non-goal, but I think we're also arguing that alone is not enough. Even if that is the case, I think we need a little bit more of how, yeah, we still need a little bit more.
Yeah, because otherwise it only works if the consumer knows exactly what the scheduler, well, not how the scheduler came to its decision, but what the scheduler is manipulating, at least. And so you still end up with coupled consumers and schedulers, not necessarily because the consumers need to be aware of how the scheduler works, but because they need to have, well, in any case, they need to have a common shared object at some point, some kind that they both understand, so that the scheduler can say, here's the thing that I've decided that you need to place on these clusters, go and do it. And so the consumer understands what that thing is. And if this CAP isn't standardizing what that thing is, then it's not, I don't think it's decoupling the two of them, but it could be just a reference to something else like work API, but that's the big question I have.
Yep, I completely understand. And yes, Laura, thank you for writing the notes.
Yeah, I'm gonna try and and
No,
represent all it.
it doesn't have
Yeah.
to be that like on the spot,
Right,
but
right.
yeah, thank you
Right.
for
Yeah.
I've been taking some notes in the agenda doc as well.
Okay, cool.
great. Thank you.
Placement.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I mean, I obviously saw both your feedbacks, and I was just thinking, well, and I actually wanted to discuss here before I chime in on a comment. But so thank you for driving this discussion.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna keep like writing this in the background, but I think does anybody else, I know that was like a lot of us talking about stuff, but anybody else have any thoughts about this CAP, either this specific part from other experience and other stuff, or in general the concept of having a placement decision API?
Well, I've like it's part question, part comment. So
Sure.
in the Argo CD example, wouldn't this make, say Argo CD implements the API, wouldn't it make Argo CD both the consumer and the producer? Because Argo CD can make decisions already based on a simple matrix. But technically, that would mean that it can first produce the decision and then consume its own decision to then place the work. I mean, that
Yeah.
I suppose that's possible.
Yeah, if they choose to do that, they can do that. They can produce the decisions themselves and then act
Because
on those decisions.
yeah, because the way work would be reconciled to any other clusters in the same set. That would of course depend on how that's implemented. Technically, it would be possible for Argo to only create a decision or for Argo to only consume the decision. You could technically have Flux create a decision or consume it, or the other way around if you wanted to. But I suppose that's kind of the point of the decoupling. But yeah, that would be a possible effect, which is, I would say good, but yeah, that would
No,
probably be what happens.
that's a really good point. I mean, that sounds like even like a additional layer or additional use case or the middle layer that you're talking about, right? So instead of just all these generators, doing directly going over to the thing, they might be able to produce the decision and then have, like you said, within Argo CD, have a consumer that capture that output and do the things. So
Yeah.
it simplified the code a bit, right? So the generators are no longer need to do the direct applying instead of focusing on the real task, which is creating the decisions. No, you're absolutely right. Like maybe I
Yeah,
can.
the reason why I got here, sorry to interrupt you, but like that, but the reason I got to that question/comment is because an alternative scenario, or maybe a parallel scenario, would be that you have essentially the decision being an output of all the possible placements, but the consumer might then pick out of all of those possible placements something that's an implementation detail of the consumer. But if there are 10 possible placements, I suppose that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be placed there.
Yes, you are right. But then that will get into the territory of cluster profile a bit, I feel like, because cluster profile is supposed to be all, all the clusters. But I guess you're saying like the decision might be a subset of cluster profile, which is this doing. Do you know what I mean? Because I feel like
Yeah.
cluster profile is, yeah.
Yeah, I think it also makes sense because technically, if you look at it from, let's say you don't have any of this and you just take whatever Argo is doing with like a generator or a matrix or something like that, then it would usually have a static list of possible destinations and then essentially a matrix multiplication if you need to make sub decisions based on that. But in this case, you get your list dynamically, and instead of duplicating the effort, because that's essentially what would be happening now. If you have any construct in Kubernetes that needs to make a placement, do something with placement information or make a placement decision, it has to individually implement and specify it. So if you have something that has a placement decision, well, it's not called that obviously, but if it has a placement rule in, say, Flux or Argo or some other engine, and you need that same information elsewhere, say in Istio or in some sort of cloud resource that also needs to know about it, then they would not have a common API to talk about it. So I suppose that this also makes information sharing, even if you're not using the placement ref or the placement decision for placement purposes, it means that the information is now available cluster-wide instead of being some specific API that nothing else is going to know about. And that's probably not the intended usage, but that would be a side effect, I think.
That's a great point. I'm gonna steal that. I'm gonna listen to the recording and then I'll add it as a
Yeah.
note
The reason why I got to that one is because that's what we're doing right now. So we have a bunch of information that's in a secret, and then it's not a secret because it's secret, but because there are so many different APIs that need the information, and we need something that contain a lot of data. So we encode it, and then we compress it, and then we encode it again. And then every system that needs that little bit of information then has to individually read it back. And that means that if it is related to information about traffic or information about placement or availability or topology awareness, all the information is, well, it's not difficult to come by, but it's always slightly unique. So it doesn't really integrate that well. And this would definitely enable that, at least for the placement information, which is pretty cool.
Sounds great. Thank you, John. That was excellent.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. Unless anybody else has some comments on this, I think that's all of my agenda item, as it were.
Right. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Mike. So I guess if nobody else has anything to talk about, we can finish early. Going once, going twice. Right, there's a heart there. So thanks everybody for attending and for the discussions, and I'll see you all next week.
Thank
Thank
you.
Have a
you.
good rest of the week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.